Hello history enthusiasts, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're embarking on an extraordinary journey through one of the most transformative and profoundly impactful periods in human history, the French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars. This monumental era, stretching from the late 18th century into the early 19th, wasn't merely a sequence of isolated events. It was a cataclysmic crucible that forged the modern world, fundamentally reshaping societies, challenging millennia-old power structures, and igniting radical new ideals that continue to resonate with astonishing force in our contemporary political landscape. We'll delve into a time when the very foundations of absolute monarchy were not just questioned, but violently overthrown, giving way to a fervent pursuit of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Concepts that, while seemingly universal today, were revolutionary and even dangerous in their original context. This period represents a pivotal turning point, a true watershed moment that saw France, a nation at the heart of European culture and power, plunge into an unprecedented maelstrom of radical political and social upheaval. It was a time of immense intellectual ferment, where the Enlightenment's grand ideas of reason, individual rights, and popular sovereignty transitioned from philosophical discourse in salons to the bloody battlefields and tumultuous streets of Paris. The impact of these events, the ideals they championed, and the conflicts they spawned, reverberated far beyond the borders of France, sending shockwaves across the entire European continent and inspiring revolutions, reforms, and counter-revolutions. In distant lands, it was a period that irrevocably altered the course of political thought, laying the groundwork for nationalism, modern warfare, and the very concept of a citizen state, forever changing the relationship between rulers and the ruled. Understanding. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars isn't just about memorizing dates and names. It's about grasping the profound forces that shaped our world, the origins of many of our democratic institutions, and the complex, often contradictory, nature of human progress. It's a story of grand aspirations and brutal realities, of heroic figures and tragic downfalls, of the enduring power of ideas and the devastating consequences of unchecked ambition. We'll explore how a bankrupt monarchy, a deeply unequal society, and a populace yearning for change converged to create an explosive cocktail, leading to a decade of revolutionary fervor, followed by the meteoric rise and fall of one of history's most enigmatic and influential military geniuses, Napoleon Bonaparte. His campaigns and reforms would redraw the map of Europe, dismantle old empires, and disseminate the revolutionary ideals, albeit often at the point of a bayonet, across vast territories. Before we plunge into the intricate details of this fascinating and often tumultuous epic, I'm genuinely curious. How is your day unfolding so far? Are you enjoying a quiet afternoon, tackling a challenging project, or perhaps just unwinding? Drop a comment below and let me know how things are going for you. Your engagement means the world to this channel. And if you find yourself captivated by the profound narratives of history, if you're as passionate about understanding the forces that shaped our modern world as I am, please consider hitting that subscribe button and joining our growing community. By subscribing, you'll ensure you don't miss any of our deep dives into the past, helping us to continue bringing these vital stories to life. Now, with that said, let's prepare to journey back in time, to the eve of a revolution that would shake the world to its very core. Before the cataclysmic storm of revolution broke over France, the nation was governed by a deeply entrenched and increasingly anachronistic system known as the Ancien Regime, or Old Regime. This structure, which had evolved over centuries, was characterized by an absolute monarchy, a rigid social hierarchy, and a profoundly inefficient economic system, all teetering on the brink of collapse. At the very pinnacle of this antiquated edifice sat King Louis XVI, a monarch who, like his Bourbon predecessors, ruled under the doctrine of divine right. This meant his authority was believed to be divinely ordained, theoretically limitless, and entirely unchecked by any form of representative assembly or constitutional constraint. Louis XVI, though not inherently tyrannical, was tragically ill-suited to navigate the monumental challenges confronting his kingdom. He was indecisive, often hesitant to implement necessary reforms, and frequently swayed by the conservative factions within his court, primarily the privileged nobility and clergy, who fiercely resisted any erosion of their ancient rights. His Queen, Marie Antoinette, an Austrian Habsburg princess, became an unfortunate symbol of the monarchy's perceived extravagance and detachment. Her lavish spending on fashion, gambling, and courtly amusements, often in stark contrast to the widespread destitution of the common people, earned her the derisive moniker Madame Deficit and made her a focal point for public resentment and satirical attacks. The opulent grandeur of the Palace of Versailles, far removed from the impoverished streets of Paris, served as a potent visual metaphor for the chasm separating the ruling elite from the suffering populace. French society under the Ancien regime was meticulously and brutally stratified into three distinct legal orders, or estates, a system that dictated an individual's rights, privileges, and burdens from birth. This rigid social framework was a primary source of the deep-seated grievances that would ultimately ignite the revolution. The first estate comprised the clergy, a relatively small group, constituting less than 1% of the total population, yet wielding immense spiritual, intellectual, and material power. They owned approximately 10% of France's most fertile land, from which they derived substantial income. Critically, the clergy enjoyed near-complete exemption from direct taxation, contributing instead a voluntary don gratuit to the state, an amount often far less than their vast wealth suggested they should. This privilege was a source of bitter resentment, particularly as the national debt spiraled. The first estate was not monolithic. It included the wealthy, aristocratic higher clergy, bishops, abbots, and cardinals who lived lives of luxury, often holding multiple benefices, and the impoverished lower clergy, parish priests and curates, who lived among the common people and often sympathized with their plight, creating internal divisions that would prove significant during the revolutionary period. The second estate consisted of the nobility, an equally small but immensely powerful segment, making up roughly 2 to 3% of the population. This elite group held vast inherited lands, often comprising 25 to 30% of the nation's territory, and monopolized the most prestigious positions within the government, the military, the judiciary, and the church. Their privileges were extensive and deeply ingrained. They were largely exempt from the most burdensome direct taxes, such as the taille, land tax, and enjoyed a plethora of feudal rights. These rights allowed them to collect dues from peasants, living on their lands, control local justice, maintain exclusive hunting and fishing rights, and even demand corvée, unpaid labor, from their tenant farmers. The nobility was also internally diverse, ranging from the ancient nobles of the sword, whose lineage traced back to medieval feudal lords, to the newer nobles of the robe, who had acquired their titles through venal offices or service to the crown. Despite their differences, they were united in their fierce defense of their inherited privileges against any attempts at reform. In stark contrast stood the Third Estate, an enormous and incredibly heterogeneous group encompassing over 95% of the French population. This vast majority bore the overwhelming brunt of taxation and lacked any meaningful political representation, creating a simmering cauldron of discontent. Within this immense estate, there were significant internal stratifications, each with its own set of grievances. At the top of the Third Estate was the bourgeoisie, the educated and increasingly wealthy middle class. This group included prosperous merchants, influential bankers, skilled lawyers, respected doctors, intellectual writers, and successful entrepreneurs. Despite their growing economic power and often considerable wealth, they were systematically excluded from positions of power and prestige reserved for the nobility. They resented the aristocratic privileges, the stifling economic regulations, such as internal tariffs and guild restrictions, that hindered their entrepreneurial spirit, and their lack of social recognition commensurate with their economic contributions. The bourgeoisie were often the intellectual vanguard of the revolution, deeply influenced by Enlightenment ideals and yearning for a meritocratic society. Below them were the urban workers, often referred to as the sans-culottes, literally without breeches, referring to their working-class attire, as opposed to the knee breeches of the aristocracy. This group included artisans, shopkeepers, journeymen, and laborers in Paris and other major cities. They faced precarious living conditions, fluctuating wages, and the constant, existential threat of starvation, especially as food prices soared. Their daily lives were a struggle for survival, and their political consciousness was sharpened by immediate economic hardship. Finally, the largest segment of the Third Estate, comprising roughly 80% of the entire population, was the peasantry. These were the farmers and agricultural laborers who toiled the land. They were burdened by an oppressive multitude of taxes: the royal taille, the gabelle, a deeply unpopular salt tax, the capitation, poll tax, and the vingtieme, income tax. In addition to these royal impositions, they were obligated to pay feudal dues to their lords, such as the sengs, a fixed payment for land use, and the champart, a share of the harvest, and to perform unpaid labor, corvée, on the lord's lands or public works. Furthermore, they paid a tithe, 1/10 of their produce, to the church. Their lives were characterized by grinding poverty, subsistence farming, and a deep-seated, generations-old resentment of the privileges enjoyed by the upper estates, who contributed little to the state's coffers while consuming a disproportionate share of its wealth. This inherently unequal social structure was exacerbated by a profound and escalating economic crisis that brought France to the brink of national bankruptcy. The primary culprit was France's staggering national debt, accumulated largely through its involvement in a series of costly and often unsuccessful wars. The 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, had been a particularly expensive and humiliating defeat, stripping France of many of its valuable colonial possessions in North America and India. Even more ruinous, financially, was France's substantial military and financial support for the American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. While strategically a victory against its old rival Britain, this intervention pushed the national treasury to the precipice of insolvency. The antiquated and inefficient tax system, which disproportionately burdened the poor and middle classes while exempting the wealthy nobility and clergy, proved utterly incapable of generating sufficient revenue to service this spiraling debt. Successive finance ministers, including Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, Jacques Necker, Charles Alexandre de Calonne, and Loménie de Brienne, attempted to introduce desperately needed fiscal reforms, such as taxing the privileged estates, but their efforts were consistently thwarted by the entrenched interests of the nobility and the powerful parliaments, high courts dominated by aristocrats, who jealously guarded their exemptions. Adding to the fiscal woes were a series of devastating harvest failures in the late 1780s, particularly in 1788 and 1789. These agricultural crises, caused by adverse weather conditions, led to widespread food shortages, especially of bread, which was the staple diet of the common people. The price of bread skyrocketed in some areas, consuming up to 80% of a laborer's daily wage. This created immense hardship, fueling widespread hunger, malnutrition, and desperate riots in both urban and rural areas. The stark contrast between the widespread suffering of the populace and the continued lavish spending of the royal court at Versailles further alienated the monarchy from its people, breeding a deep sense of injustice and resentment. Simultaneously, the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment were steadily eroding the ideological foundations of the Ancien regime, providing a powerful intellectual framework for critiquing the existing order and imagining a more just society. Philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, with his radical concept of the social contract and the general will, challenged the very legitimacy of absolute monarchy and advocated for popular sovereignty, where power resided with the people. Montesquieu's ideas on the separation of powers, advocating for distinct branches of government to prevent tyranny and ensure checks and balances, directly contradicted the centralized, unchecked authority of the French king. Voltaire championed freedom of speech, religious tolerance, and civil liberties, relentlessly criticizing the arbitrary power of the church and the state. Venice, Diderot and Jean-Léon D'Alembert, as multi-volume encyclopedia, served as a monumental compendium of Enlightenment thought, disseminating rational ideas and critiques of traditional authority to an increasingly literate public, particularly within the bourgeoisie. These radical ideas, emphasizing reason, individual rights, and the equality of all citizens before the law, circulated widely through intellectual salons, bustling coffeehouses, clandestine pamphlets, and Masonic lodges, providing the intellectual ammunition for a revolution. The success of the American Revolution served as a tangible, living example that Enlightenment ideals could be put into practice, and that a people could successfully overthrow an oppressive monarchy. French soldiers who had fought alongside the Americans, like the charismatic Marquis de Lafayette, returned home imbued with Republican ideals and a first-hand taste for liberty and self-governance. The American Declaration of Independence, with its powerful assertion of unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, resonated deeply with those yearning for change in France. While France had strategically supported the American cause, primarily to weaken its old rival Britain, it inadvertently helped to plant the seeds of revolution within its own borders, demonstrating that radical political change was not merely a philosophical concept, but an achievable reality, inspiring hope and determination among those who sought to dismantle the Ancien regime. This confluence of a bankrupt state, a deeply unequal and resentful society, a starving populace, powerful, new intellectual currents, and an ineffective, indecisive monarch created an incredibly volatile powder keg, ready to explode. The growing frustration of the bourgeoisie, who felt their economic power and intellectual prowess were not matched by political influence or social status, combined with the desperate plight of the peasants and urban poor, forged a powerful, albeit disparate, coalition against the established order. The stage was meticulously set for a confrontation that would forever alter the course of French history, sending profound ripples across the globe and ushering in an era of unprecedented change. The Ancien regime, with its inherent inequalities and systemic inefficiencies, was already a tinderbox, but a series of immediate catalysts, primarily a deepening financial crisis and the king's desperate attempts to address it, ignited the revolutionary flame. By 1788, France's treasury was utterly depleted, burdened by an astronomical debt equivalent to several years of national revenue. Years of lavish court spending, coupled with the crippling costs of the 7 Years' War and, most ruinously, the financial and military support for the American Revolution, had pushed the monarchy to the precipice of bankruptcy. With no other viable options, King Louis XVI, advised by his finance minister Jacques Necker, reluctantly conceded to a radical step, convening the Estates General. This ancient representative assembly, comprising delegates from all three estates, had not met since 1614, a testament to the absolute power wielded by French monarchs for over a century and a half. The decision to call it was a tacit admission of the monarchy's inability to govern alone, and an unwitting surrender of some of its absolute authority. The announcement sparked a wave of unprecedented political activity across France for months, leading up to the Assembly. Communities, guilds, and parishes meticulously drafted cahiers de doléances, or grievance books. These documents, collected from every corner of the kingdom, were intended to present the concerns and demands of each estate to the king. The cahiers revealed a fascinating blend of shared aspirations and fundamental divisions. All three estates, including many within the first and second, expressed a desire for a more just and efficient government, a constitutional monarchy that would limit royal absolutism, and a more equitable tax system. However, the cahiers of the Third Estate went much further, unequivocally demanding the abolition of feudal privileges, equal rights for all citizens before the law, freedom of speech and the press, and an end to arbitrary imprisonment. They articulated a profound yearning for a society founded on merit rather than birthright, laying bare the deep chasm that separated their vision for France from the entrenched interests of the privileged orders. When the Estates General finally convened at Versailles on May 5, 1789, the air was thick with anticipation and tension. The very first order of business immediately exposed the irreconcilable differences that would define the early stages of the Revolution. The method of voting. Traditionally, the Estates General voted by order, meaning each of the three estates deliberated separately and cast a single collective vote. This system effectively gave the first and second estates, despite representing a tiny fraction of the population, 2 votes against the third estate's 1, ensuring that any reforms threatening their privileges would be easily blocked. The third estate, having been granted double representation, meaning they had as many deputies as the first and second estates combined, vehemently demanded that voting be conducted by head, where each individual deputy would cast a vote. This would give the third estate, supported by sympathetic liberal nobles and lower clergy, a decisive majority and the power to enact meaningful change. The king, indecisive and wary of alienating the nobility, sided with the traditionalists, insisting on voting by order. This impasse dragged on for weeks, paralyzing the assembly and fueling the frustration of the Third Estate. On June 17, 1789, in a momentous act of defiance and self-assertion, the deputies of the Third Estate, recognizing themselves as the true representatives of the nation, unilaterally declared themselves a National Assembly. This bold move was a direct challenge to the king's authority and a revolutionary assertion of popular sovereignty. 3 days later, on June 20th, finding their usual meeting hall locked and guarded by royal troops, the deputies gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court. There, they took the solemn tennis court oath, vowing not to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances require, until the constitution of the kingdom is established and consolidated upon solid foundations. This oath was a pivotal moment, transforming a legislative dispute into a revolutionary act. It marked the definitive break from the ancien regime and signaled the birth of a new political order, one where sovereignty resided not with the monarch, but with the nation itself. Though Louis XVI initially resisted, ordering the estates to disperse, the unwavering resolve of the National Assembly, coupled with the defection of many liberal clergy and nobles, forced his reluctant acceptance. He effectively recognized the National Assembly, but simultaneously began secretly massing troops around Paris and Versailles, a move that would prove disastrous. The king's troop movements and his dismissal of the popular finance minister Jacques Necker on July 11th, interpreted by the Parisian populace as a prelude to a royal crackdown, ignited widespread panic and unrest in the capital. Rumors of royal plots and military suppression spread like wildfire. The people of Paris, already suffering from severe bread shortages and economic hardship, began to arm themselves, seizing weapons from armories and demanding gunpowder. On July 14, 1789, this volatile atmosphere culminated in the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille, a medieval fortress used as a state prison, though holding only a handful of prisoners at the time, symbolized the arbitrary power and tyranny of the monarchy. An enraged crowd seeking gunpowder and arms converged on the fortress. After a tense standoff and a bloody skirmish, the garrison surrendered. The fall of the Bastille was not merely a military victory. It was an immense symbolic triumph. It represented the collapse of royal authority and the triumph of popular will. The king's power was visibly broken, and the people of Paris had demonstrated their willingness to fight for their liberty. The immediate aftermath saw the formation of the National Guard, a citizen militia led by the Marquis de Lafayette, and a wave of emigration by royalist nobles, fearing for their lives. The 14th of July, Bastille Day, remains France's national holiday, a permanent reminder of this foundational moment. The revolutionary fervor quickly spread beyond Paris. In the countryside, a wave of peasant uprisings, fueled by centuries of resentment, economic hardship, and exaggerated rumors of aristocratic plots to starve the populace, swept across France during late July and early August. This period, known as the Great Fear, saw peasants arming themselves, attacking chateaux, and, most significantly, burning the manorial rolls that recorded their feudal obligations and dues. This widespread rural unrest, though often violent, was a powerful expression of the peasantry's desire to dismantle the feudal system that had oppressed them for so long. The National Assembly, meeting in Versailles, was deeply alarmed by the breakdown of order and the potential for anarchy. In a dramatic all-night session on August 4, 1789, driven by a mixture of fear and genuine reformist zeal, members of the nobility and clergy rose one after another to renounce their feudal rights and privileges. This extraordinary event led to the August Decrees, which formally abolished feudalism, serfdom, the tithe, venality of offices, the practice of selling, public offices, and the special privileges of the nobility and clergy. It was a revolutionary act that dismantled the legal and social foundations of the Ancien regime, effectively sweeping away centuries of aristocratic and clerical dominance and establishing, in principle, a society based on civil equality. Weeks later, on August 26, 1789, the National Assembly issued one of the most significant documents in human history, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Heavily influenced by Enlightenment philosophy and drawing inspiration from the American Declaration of Independence, this foundational text proclaimed the universal principles upon which the new French society would be built. It asserted that all men are born and remain free and equal in rights, that sovereignty resides in the nation, and that liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression are unalienable natural rights. It guaranteed freedom of speech, press, and religion, and established principles of due process and equality before the law. The Declaration was a radical departure from the hierarchical values of the Ancien regime, articulating a vision of a society based on individual rights, popular sovereignty, and the rule of law. While its initial application had limitations, notably excluding women and enslaved people from its full benefits, its universalistic claims would resonate across the globe, inspiring liberation movements and democratic aspirations for centuries to come. Despite these monumental legislative achievements, the immediate crisis in Paris persisted, particularly the severe bread shortages. On October 5, 1789, thousands of Parisian women, driven by hunger and rage, marched 12 miles in the Aisne, Rhine from Paris to Versailles. They were joined by the National Guard, led by Lafayette, who reluctantly accompanied them to maintain order. The Women's March on Versailles was a powerful demonstration of popular power, demanding bread and the king's return to Paris, believing that his presence in the capital would alleviate their suffering and ensure his commitment to the revolution. The next day, the angry crowd stormed the palace, killing several guards. The royal family, under immense pressure, was forced to leave Versailles and relocate to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, effectively becoming prisoners of the revolution. This event was profoundly significant. It brought the monarchy under the direct influence and scrutiny of the Parisian populace, signaling the end of the king's independent authority and marking a decisive shift of power from the royal court to the streets of the capital. The revolution had truly entered a new, more radical phase, with the people of Paris now a direct and powerful force in its unfolding drama. The relocation of the royal family to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, effectively under the watchful eye of the Parisian populace, marked a profound shift in the dynamics of the French Revolution. No longer insulated by the grandeur of Versailles, the monarchy was now directly exposed to the simmering discontent and radicalizing fervor of the capital. With the king and the National Assembly now both in Paris, the monumental task of fundamentally restructuring France, transforming it from an absolute monarchy into a constitutional one, began in earnest. The National Assembly, having declared itself the National Constituent Assembly, embarked on an ambitious program of reform, aiming to dismantle the vestiges of the ancien regime and build a new society founded on the principles enshrined in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. One of the most immediate and far-reaching reforms was the complete administrative and judicial reorganization of France. The ancient, complex, and often overlapping provincial divisions, with their myriad customs and laws, were swept away. In their place, the Assembly created 83 new, uniformly sized departments, each with its own elected administration, ensuring a standardized, centralized, and more efficient governance across the entire nation. This radical simplification aimed to break down regional loyalties and foster a unified national identity. Simultaneously, the entire judicial system was reformed. Old aristocratic parliaments were abolished, and a new hierarchy of elected judges and citizen juries was established, ensuring that justice was administered more equitably and transparently, theoretically accessible to all citizens regardless of birth or wealth. This move was a direct attack on the traditional power bases of the nobility and a significant step towards a more meritocratic society. Economically, the Assembly sought to liberalize trade and address the crippling national debt. They abolished internal tariffs and guild restrictions, promoting free enterprise and competition, a move that largely benefited the bourgeoisie. However, the most audacious economic measure was the nationalization of all church lands in November 1789. These vast properties, estimated to be worth a quarter of France's wealth, were confiscated by the state. To monetize this immense asset and alleviate the debt, the Assembly issued assignats, paper currency backed by the value of the confiscated church lands. Initially intended as bonds, they quickly became a circulating medium. While initially successful in providing liquidity and paying off some debt, the continuous issuance of assignats, far exceeding the value of the underlying land, led to rapid inflation. This inflation disproportionately harmed the urban poor, whose wages failed to keep pace with soaring prices, particularly for essential goods like bread, exacerbating economic hardship and fueling further discontent among the sans-culottes. Nationalization of church lands was inextricably linked to the Assembly's most controversial and divisive reform, the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, enacted in July 1790. This radical decree aimed to bring the Catholic Church in France under state control, transforming it into a national institution rather than an independent, Rome-aligned power. Bishops and priests were to be elected by citizens, including non-Catholics, their salaries paid by the state, and their numbers reduced. Dioceses were redrawn to align with the new departmental boundaries. Crucially, all clergy were required to swear an oath of loyalty to the civil constitution. This act created an immediate and profound schism within French society. Many devout Catholics, including a significant portion of the clergy, viewed this as an unacceptable infringement on spiritual authority and a direct attack on their faith. Those who swore the oath became juring priests, often supported by the revolutionaries, while those who refused were non-juring or refractory priests, who became symbols of counter-revolution and were often persecuted. The civil constitution alienated a vast segment of the population, particularly in rural areas, and transformed religious loyalty into a political litmus test, deepening the divisions within France and strengthening the forces of counter-revolution. By September 1791, the National Constituent Assembly finally completed its monumental task, promulgating the Constitution of 1791. This document established a constitutional monarchy, marking the formal transition from absolute rule. The king remained the head of the executive branch, but his powers were severely limited. He retained a suspensive veto over legislation, meaning he could delay, but not permanently block, laws passed by the newly created unicameral Legislative Assembly. The assembly itself was to be elected, but voting rights were restricted based on property qualifications, creating a distinction between active citizens, men over 25 who paid a certain amount in taxes, roughly 2/3 of adult males, who could vote, and passive citizens, the poor, women, and others, who could not. This reflected the bourgeois nature of the revolution at this stage, as the middle class sought to consolidate its power while excluding the lower classes from direct political participation. While a significant step towards representative government, it fell short of universal suffrage and left many feeling disenfranchised. Despite these legislative achievements, the political landscape was becoming increasingly volatile and polarized. The revolution fostered a vibrant, if often chaotic, public sphere, with the proliferation of newspapers, pamphlets, and most importantly, political clubs. These clubs became crucial centers for political debate, organization, and the dissemination of ideas, effectively functioning as nascent political parties. The most influential was the Jacobin Club, initially a moderate forum for constitutional monarchists and liberal aristocrats, but which progressively became more radical, attracting figures like Maximilien Robespierre. Its network of affiliated clubs across France gave it immense national reach. More radical still was the Cordeliers Club, a more populist organization, whose prominent members included Georges Danton and Jean-Paul Marat, advocating for universal male suffrage and direct democracy, often appealing directly to the sans-culottes. These clubs played a pivotal role in shaping public opinion, mobilizing popular action, and pushing the revolution towards more extreme measures. The king, Louis XVI, never genuinely accepted his diminished role or the radical changes imposed upon the church. He secretly corresponded with other European monarchs, appealing for their intervention to restore his absolute power. His deep resentment culminated in the infamous flight to Varennes in June 1791. The royal family, disguised, attempted to escape Paris and flee to the royalist stronghold of Montmedy near the Austrian-Netherlands border, where loyal troops awaited. However, their escape was bungled. They were recognized and apprehended in the town of Varennes and forcibly escorted back to Paris under heavy guard. This event was a catastrophic blow to the monarchy's legitimacy. It shattered any remaining public trust in Louis XVI, exposing his true intentions to abandon the revolution and seek foreign aid to crush it. For many, it confirmed the king as a traitor to the nation, irrevocably fueling the growing Republican sentiment and calls for his dethronement. The idea of a constitutional monarchy, already fragile, was severely undermined. The aftermath of Varennes saw a sharp increase in Republican agitation. On July 17, 1791, a large crowd, organized by the Cordeliers Club, gathered at the Champ Mars to sign a petition demanding the king's abdication and the establishment of a republic. The National Guard, under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette, was dispatched to disperse the crowd. In a tragic and controversial turn of events, the National Guard opened fire on the unarmed petitioners, killing dozens. The Champ de Mars massacre was a brutal suppression of popular dissent by the very forces that were supposed to protect the revolution. It exposed the deep divisions within the revolutionary ranks, marking a clear split between the moderate constitutional monarchists, who feared further radicalization and anarchy, and the increasingly powerful Republican faction. It also demonstrated the willingness of the authorities to use force against the very people who had brought them to power, further radicalizing the sans-culottes and pushing them towards more extreme leadersdom as internal divisions deepened. A threat from abroad loomed larger. European monarchs, initially viewing the French Revolution with a mixture of disdain and amusement, grew increasingly alarmed as its radicalism escalated and the safety of the French royal family, particularly Marie Antoinette, sister of the Austrian emperor, became precarious. Thousands of émigrés, aristocratic and royalist exiles, had fled France, congregating in neighboring states, particularly in Koblenz, where they formed counter-revolutionary armies and tirelessly lobbied foreign powers for military intervention to restore the ancien regime. In August 1791, Emperor Leopold II of Austria and King Frederick William II of Prussia issued the Declaration of Pillnitz. This vaguely worded statement declared their joint concern for the French monarch and threatened intervention if other European powers agreed, ostensibly to restore Louis XVI's full powers. While intended as a deterrent, it backfired spectacularly in France, being widely interpreted as a direct threat and a confirmation of the king's complicity with foreign enemies, further inflaming revolutionary fervor and calls for a preemptive war. Within France, the debate over war raged. The Girondins, a faction within the Legislative Assembly, often associated with the more moderate wing of republicanism, strongly advocated for war. They believed it would unify the nation against a common enemy, expose traitors within France, and spread revolutionary ideals across Europe, liberating oppressed peoples from tyrannical monarchies. The king himself, ironically, also favored war, secretly hoping that a French defeat would lead to foreign intervention and the restoration of his absolute power. Only a few, notably Maximilien Robespierre, initially opposed the war, fearing it would lead to military dictatorship and the suppression of revolutionary gains. Despite these warnings, the momentum for war became irresistible. On April 20th, 1792, the Legislative Assembly, with the king's reluctant assent, formally declared war on Austria, with Prussia quickly joining the Austrian side. This momentous decision marked the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars, a conflict that would engulf Europe for the next 2 decades, profoundly reshaping its political landscape and forever altering the nature of warfare. The initial phase of the war was disastrous for France. The French army, weakened by the emigration of many aristocratic officers and suffering from disorganization and lack of discipline, performed poorly. Early defeats and desertions fueled paranoia and fear of invasion within France. The situation reached a critical point in July 1792 when the Duke of Brunswick, commander of the combined Austro-Prussian forces, issued the infamous Brunswick Manifesto. This declaration threatened to utterly destroy Paris if the slightest harm came to the French royal family. Intended to intimidate the revolutionaries and protect the king, it had the opposite effect. It confirmed the Parisian populace's deepest suspicions. that Louis XVI was actively conspiring with foreign enemies against his own nation. The manifesto was seen as an intolerable insult to French sovereignty and a direct incitement to rebellion. The rage ignited by the Brunswick Manifesto, coupled with ongoing economic hardship and the perceived treachery of the king, culminated in the August 10th insurrection of 1792. Thousands of armed Parisian sans-culottes, joined by radical volunteers from the provinces known as fédères, stormed the Tuileries Palace, where the royal family resided. After a bloody and desperate battle with the king's loyal Swiss guards, many of whom were massacred, the palace was overrun, the royal family, having fled to the Legislative Assembly for protection, was effectively captured. Under immense popular pressure, the Legislative Assembly, recognizing the complete collapse of royal authority, voted to suspend the king and imprison the royal family. This act effectively ended the constitutional monarchy established just a year prior. A new, more radical assembly, a national convention, was immediately called for to be elected by universal male suffrage, with the explicit mandate to draft a new, truly republican constitution for France. The August 10th insurrection marked the definitive end of the monarchy in France and ushered in the radical phase of the revolution, paving the way for the First French Republic. The August 10th insurrection of 1792, which saw the storming of the Tuileries Palace and the suspension of King Louis XVI, irrevocably shattered the remnants of the constitutional monarchy and propelled France into its most radical phase. The immediate aftermath was characterized by an atmosphere of intense fear, paranoia, and revolutionary zeal. As foreign armies, particularly the Prussians, advanced rapidly towards Paris, fueled by the Brunswick Manifesto's threats, the capital descended into a state of acute anxiety. Rumors of counter-revolutionary plots within the city's prisons, where many royalists, non-juring priests, and suspected enemies of the revolution were held, spread like wildfire. The prevailing fear was that these prisoners would break out and aid the invading forces, stabbing the revolution in the back. This volatile cocktail of panic and suspicion erupted in the September massacres, a horrific wave of extrajudicial killings that swept through Parisian prisons from September 2nd to 6th, 1792, incited by radical journalists like Jean-Paul Marat, who called for the elimination of internal enemies, and fueled by the rhetoric of figures like Georges Danton, who famously declared, "To conquer, we must dare, dare again, dare always." Enraged sans-culottes and National Guardsmen stormed the prisons. They set up makeshift tribunals, summarily tried and executed thousands of inmates, including nobles, priests, common criminals, and suspected royalists. Estimates vary, but between 1,100 and 1,600 prisoners were brutally murdered, often with extreme violence. While condemned by many later historians, these massacres were viewed by some revolutionaries as a necessary, albeit gruesome, act of self-preservation, demonstrating the raw, untamed power of the sans-culottes and the terrifying consequences of perceived counter-revolutionary activity. This dark episode stained the revolution's reputation, but also solidified the determination of its most radical elements. Amidst this chaos, the newly elected National Convention convened on September 20th, 1792, a day that also saw the crucial French victory at the Battle of Valmy, halting the Prussian advance and providing a much-needed morale boost. The convention's very first act, on September 21st, was to formally abolish the monarchy in France, declaring that royalty is abolished in France. The following day, September 22nd, 1792, was officially proclaimed the first day of Year One of the French Republic. This marked the birth of the First French Republic, a monumental shift from centuries of monarchical rule to a government founded, at least in principle, on popular sovereignty and republican ideals. The convention immediately set about drafting A new constitution, reflecting its republican aspirations. The fate of the former king, Louis XVI, became the convention's next pressing and highly contentious issue. Debates raged for weeks over whether he should be tried, and if so, what his punishment should be. The more moderate faction, the Girondins, generally favored clemency or exile, fearing that his execution would provoke further international condemnation and internal strife. The more radical faction, the Montagnards, meaning the mountain, due to their elevated seats in the convention, and largely synonymous with the Jacobin at this stage, led by figures like Robespierre, Marat, and Saint-Just, argued vehemently for his execution. They viewed Louis as a traitor to the nation, whose continued existence posed a threat to the Republic. Saint-Just famously declared, "No one can reign innocently." After a lengthy trial, the convention found Louis XVI guilty of treason by a significant majority. A vote on his sentence was incredibly close, with a narrow majority voting for death. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI, now simply referred to as Citizen Louis Capet, was publicly executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution, formerly Place Louis XV, now Place de la Concorde. His execution sent shockwaves across Europe, confirming the revolutionary government's uncompromising resolve and irrevocably severing France's ties with its monarchical past. It also solidified the determination of European monarchies to crush the revolution. The execution of the king, far from unifying France, exacerbated the already deep divisions within the National Convention and the nation at large. Two dominant factions emerged, locked in a bitter struggle for control. The Girondins, often representing the interests of the provincial bourgeoisie, were generally more moderate. They advocated for a decentralized federal republic, feared the radicalism of the Parisian sans-culottes, and sought to curb the influence of the Paris Commune. They were wary of excessive state intervention in the economy and preferred a more gradual, legalistic approach to revolutionary change. Their leaders included Jacques-Pierre Brissot and Madame Roland. The Montagnards, drawing their strength from Paris and the support of the sans-culottes, were far more radical. They championed a strong, centralized government, believed in the necessity of extreme measures to save the Republic, and were willing to use popular force to achieve their aims. They favored price controls and requisitioning to alleviate the suffering of the urban poor. Key figures were Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Jean-Paul Marat. The ideological and political struggle between these two factions intensified, fueled by the escalating internal and external crisis. The war with European monarchies, which had begun in April 1792, escalated dramatically after the execution of Louis XVI. Outraged by the regicide, Britain, Spain, Portugal, and the Dutch Republic joined Austria and Prussia, forming the first coalition against revolutionary France. This formidable alliance posed an existential threat to the nascent republic. French armies suffered severe defeats, losing territories like the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, and the Rhineland. The threat of invasion was constant, and the republic found itself fighting for its very survival on multiple fronts. The convention responded by implementing the levy in masse in August 1793, a mass conscription that mobilized all able-bodied men for military service, transforming the French army into a formidable, ideologically driven fighting force, unprecedented in its scale and zeal. Compounding the external threats were widespread internal rebellions. The most significant was the Vendée Rebellion in western France, which erupted in March 1793. This was a large-scale, brutal counter-revolutionary uprising, primarily driven by devout Catholic peasants who resented the civil constitution of the clergy, the execution of the king, and the levy en masse. They were often led by local nobles and non-juring priests, fighting under the banner of God and King. The Vendée became a brutal civil war, characterized by extreme violence and atrocities on both sides, consuming vast resources and diverting crucial troops from the war effort against foreign powers. Simultaneously, several major provincial cities, including Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, and Toulon, rose in revolt against the central authority of the Convention, often led by Girondin sympathizers who feared the growing radicalism and Parisian dominance. These federalist revolts further fragmented the Republic and presented another grave threat to its stability. In response to these overwhelming internal and external crises, the National Convention, increasingly dominated by the Montagnards, took drastic measures to centralize power and suppress dissent. In April 1793, it established the Committee of Public Safety, initially conceived as a temporary body to oversee the war effort and manage the government. It rapidly evolved into the de facto executive power of France, wielding immense authority. Its members, elected monthly by the Convention, included figures like Georges Danton, and most prominently, Maximilien Robespierre, who joined in July 1793 and quickly became its dominant figure. The committee's mandate was to protect the Republic from all enemies, foreign and domestic, and it soon began to exercise dictatorial powers, effectively bypassing the Legislative Assembly and the Executive Councils to enforce its will and crush all opposition. The Committee of Public Safety, along with the Committee of General Security, responsible for policing and internal security, initiated the period known as the Reign of Terror. This systematic campaign of repression was justified by its proponents as a necessary, albeit temporary, measure to save the Republic from its myriad enemies. The core principle was that terror is nothing other than prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. In September 1793, the Convention passed the infamous Law of Suspects, which broadly defined who could be considered an enemy of the Revolution. Anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activities, or even those who merely expressed insufficient enthusiasm for the Republic, could be arrested and tried by the Revolutionary Tribunal. The definition of suspect was deliberately vague, allowing for widespread arrests based on denunciation or mere suspicion. The Revolutionary Tribunal, established in Paris, became the primary instrument of the terror. Trials were often swift, lacking due process, and convictions frequently led to execution by guillotine. Thousands were arrested, and hundreds were executed in Paris alone. Prominent figures who had once been heroes of the Revolution, including many Girondin leaders, were among the first victims, purged from the Convention in June 1793 under pressure from the sans-culottes and subsequently tried and executed. Terror also targeted royalists, non-juring priests, and anyone perceived as an internal threat. Revolutionary committees were established throughout France, replicating the Parisian model and extending the reach of repression into the provinces. Beyond political repression, the revolutionary government implemented a series of radical economic and social measures, often driven by the demands of the sans-culottes and the exigencies of war. The law of the maximum, enacted in September 1793, imposed price controls on essential goods like bread and flour, as well as wage controls, in an attempt to combat inflation and ensure food supply for the urban poor. While intended to alleviate hardship, it often led to black markets and shortages. The government also implemented forced requisitions of food and supplies from the countryside to feed the armies and the cities in a radical attempt to break with the past and establish a new, rational society. The Convention also embarked on a campaign of de-Christianization. Churches were closed, religious symbols were destroyed, and the worship of reason or the supreme being was promoted. The Gregorian calendar was replaced by the French Republican calendar, which began with the proclamation of the Republic, September 22, 1792, as year I, and reorganized the year into 12 months of 3 10-day weeks, eliminating Sundays and Christian holidays. This was an ambitious effort to dismantle the influence of the Catholic Church and create a new, secular civic religion. The period of the Terror saw the consolidation of power in the hands of the Committee of Public Safety, particularly Robespierre, often referred to as the Incorruptible. He believed that virtue and terror were inseparable, arguing that terror was necessary to protect the Republic and purify it of its enemies. While effective in suppressing internal revolts and mobilizing the nation for war, the escalating violence and the arbitrary nature of justice created a climate of fear that eventually consumed its own architects. The revolution, born of ideals of liberty and equality, had entered a dark and paradoxical phase, where the defense of those very ideals seemed to necessitate the suppression of individual freedoms and the Coalition's widespread use of state-sponsored violence. The stage was set for the Terror to reach its bloody climax as the revolution devoured its own children. The period following the establishment of the Committee of Public Safety and the initiation of the Reign of Terror saw the French Revolution reach its most intense and, arguably, most terrifying zenith. Maximilien Robespierre, often referred to as the Incorruptible, emerged as the dominant figure within the committee, wielding immense, almost dictatorial, power. He genuinely believed that the Republic could only be saved and purified through the rigorous application of revolutionary virtue, enforced by equally rigorous terror. For Robespierre and his staunch allies, the ends justified the means. The elimination of all enemies, real or perceived, was a sacred duty to safeguard the revolution and establish a truly virtuous society. He systematically purged both the more moderate factions, such as the Dantonists, followers of Georges Danton, who advocated for a relaxation of the Terror, and the ultra-radicals, like the Hebertists, followers of Jacques Hébert, who pushed for even greater dechristianization and social leveling. By eliminating these rivals, Robespierre effectively isolated himself, but also removed any significant internal opposition to his vision. The Terror reached its horrifying peak in the spring and summer of 1794, a period often referred to as the Great Terror. On June 10, 1794, the Committee of Public Safety enacted the infamous law of 22 Prairial. This draconian legislation dramatically accelerated the pace of trials before the Revolutionary Tribunal and stripped defendants of nearly all their legal protections. It eliminated the need for witnesses, allowed for conviction based solely on moral proof, i.e. suspicion, and offered only 2 verdicts, acquittal or death. This law unleashed a torrent of executions, transforming the guillotine into a relentless instrument of state policy. During the 7 weeks following its passage, over 1,300 people were sent to the scaffold in Paris alone, a stark increase from the previous months. The victims were no longer just aristocrats or royalists. They included ordinary citizens, peasants, and even former revolutionaries, caught in the ever-widening net of suspicion. The atmosphere in Paris became one of pervasive fear, where a careless word or a perceived lack of revolutionary enthusiasm could lead to denunciation and a swift, fatal trial. Adding to the chilling atmosphere, Robespierre, deeply influenced by Rousseau's ideas, attempted to establish a new civic religion to replace Catholicism and the more extreme dechristianization efforts. On June 8, 1794, he orchestrated the lavish festival of the Supreme Being, a grand public ceremony in Paris, where he, as president of the National Convention, played the central role, delivering a speech and setting fire to effigies representing atheism and vice. While intended to provide a moral and spiritual foundation for the Republic, this event was widely perceived as an attempt by Robespierre to establish a personal cult and consolidate his own power. further alienating many of his colleagues who saw it as a dangerous step towards dictatorship. His increasingly messianic pronouncements and his veiled threats against unnamed conspirators within the convention fueled a desperate fear among those who realized they might be his next target. The very intensity of the terror and Robespierre's increasingly isolated and absolute control ultimately led to his downfall. Members of the Committee of Public Safety and the National Convention, fearing that they would be the next victims of his purges, began to conspire against him. They included former allies who had grown weary of the bloodshed and those who simply feared for their own lives. On 9 Thermidor, Year 2, July 27, 1794, a dramatic session unfolded in the National Convention. As Robespierre attempted to address the assembly, he was shouted down and prevented from speaking. Accusations of tyranny and dictatorship were hurled against him. The convention, in a sudden surge of collective defiance, voted for his arrest, and that of his closest allies, including Saint-Just and Couthon. Although Robespierre briefly escaped and attempted to rally the Paris Commune in his defense, the support he once commanded from the sans-culottes had waned, partly due to the economic hardship caused by the law of the maximum and the relentless executions. The National Guard, under the convention's orders, quickly apprehended him. The following day, July 28, 1794, Robespierre, along with 21 of his associates, was sent to the guillotine without trial, a fittingly ironic end for the architect of the terror. The fall of Robespierre marked the beginning of the Thermidorian reaction, a significant turning point that saw a decisive shift away from the radicalism of the Jacobin period and the excesses of the terror. The Thermidorians, a diverse coalition of those who had overthrown Robespierre, many of whom had themselves been deeply involved in the terror, sought to dismantle the machinery of repression and restore a more moderate, bourgeois-dominated republic. The Revolutionary Tribunal was purged and eventually abolished. The law of 22 prairial was repealed, and thousands of political prisoners were released. Jacobin clubs were closed down, and their influence was systematically suppressed. The sans-culottes, who had been the driving force behind the radical phase, were disarmed and marginalized, losing their political power. However, the Thermidorian reaction was not a return to calm. It was often accompanied by its own forms of violence. In many regions, particularly in the south, a white terror erupted, as royalists and moderate factions sought revenge against former Jacobin and their sympathizers. Gangs of Muscadins dandies roamed the streets, attacking Jacobin, and summary executions of former revolutionaries occurred. This period was also characterized by a relaxation of moral strictures, a resurgence of lavish fashion and social life among the wealthy, and a widespread desire for stability and an end to revolutionary turmoil. The economic situation remained precarious, with the abolition of price controls leading to hyperinflation and widespread hardship for the poor, further fueling social unrest. The Thermidorians seeking to establish a stable, conservative republic that would prevent both a return to monarchy and a relapse into radical democracy, drafted a new constitution, the Constitution of Year 3, 1795. This document established the Directory, a 5-man executive body chosen by the legislature, designed to prevent the concentration of power in any single individual. The legislature itself was bicameral, composed of 2 councils, the Council of 500, which proposed legislation, and the Council of Ancients, which approved or rejected it. Voting rights were once again restricted by property qualifications, effectively disenfranchising the sans-culottes and ensuring that power remained firmly in the hands of the propertied classes. The Directory was intended to be a government of the men of property, a safeguard against both royalist reaction and Jacobin resurgence. However, the Directory proved to be inherently unstable and largely ineffective. Its structure was designed with numerous checks and balances to prevent tyranny, but these often led to governmental paralysis and inefficiency. The annual elections for a third of the legislature created constant political instability and made long-term policy difficult. The Directory itself was often plagued by internal divisions, corruption, and a lack of strong leadership. It struggled to address France's persistent economic problems, including rampant inflation and a collapsing currency, which continued to cause widespread misery. The government's reliance on assignats, which had become virtually worthless, led to economic chaos. Politically, the Directory faced constant threats from both the left and the right. Royalist sentiment, though suppressed, remained strong, leading to conspiracies and attempted coups such as the Vendémiaire uprising in October 1795, which was famously put down by a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte. From the left, remnants of the Jacobin and more radical elements continued to agitate, most notably through Gracchus Babeff's Conspiracy of Equals in 1796, which advocated for a communist-like society based on absolute equality and the abolition of private property. Although Babeff's plot was quickly uncovered and suppressed, it highlighted the enduring radical aspirations that the Directory sought to contain. To maintain power, the Directory increasingly resorted to undemocratic means, including annulling election results that favored its opponents and relying heavily on the military to suppress internal insurrections and enforce its will. The coup d'état of Fructidor in 1797, where the Directory used the army to purge royalist-leaning deputies from the councils, demonstrated its growing dependence on military force. Despite the internal turmoil and political instability, France continued to achieve remarkable military successes abroad. The wars against the First Coalition persisted, and the French revolutionary armies, fueled by nationalistic fervor and the levy en masse, proved to be formidable. Under the command of talented and ambitious generals who had risen through the ranks based on merit rather than birth, France not only defended its borders, but also expanded its influence. Campaigns in the Netherlands, the Rhineland, and Italy brought significant victories, leading to the establishment of sister republics, client states, that spread French revolutionary ideals and provided valuable resources and indemnities to the struggling French treasury. These military triumphs, often achieved despite the Directory's own weaknesses, created a growing sense of national pride and a longing for a strong, decisive leader who could bring both internal stability and external glory. The stage was being meticulously set for the emergence of such a figure, one who would ultimately capitalize on the Directory's failures and the nation's yearning for order, forever altering the course of French and European history. The political instability and inherent weaknesses of the Directory, coupled with France's continued military successes abroad, created a vacuum of leadership that was ripe for exploitation. The nation, exhausted by a decade of revolutionary turmoil, economic hardship, and constant political infighting, yearned for stability, order, and a strong hand to guide its destiny. This desperate desire for a decisive leader would pave the way for the meteoric rise of one of history's most extraordinary figures, Napoleon Bonaparte. Born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, just a year after it was acquired by France from Genoa, Napoleon came from a relatively modest noble family. His Corsican origins and strong sense of identity initially set him apart, but his exceptional intellect and ambition quickly became apparent. He attended military academies in mainland France, first at Brienne and then at the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, where he specialized in artillery. Despite facing initial prejudice as a provincial outsider, his intense study of military history, strategy, and tactics, combined with an innate mathematical brilliance, marked him as a prodigy. The French Revolution, with its meritocratic ethos, provided the perfect crucible for his talents. The emigration of many aristocratic officers created unprecedented opportunities for rapid promotion, based on ability rather than birth. Napoleon distinguished himself early on, notably at the Siege of Toulon in 1793, where his innovative artillery tactics helped dislodge British forces, earning him promotion to brigadier general at the astonishingly young age of 24. His decisive role in suppressing the royalist Vendémiaire uprising in Paris in 1795, firing a whiff of grapeshot into the rebellious crowds, further showcased his ruthlessness and effectiveness, bringing him to the attention of the Directory. His true genius, however, burst onto the European stage with the Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797. Appointed commander of the ragtag, underfed, and demoralized French army of Italy, Napoleon transformed it into a formidable fighting machine. He inspired his troops with promises of glory and plunder, and more importantly, with his electrifying leadership. Facing numerically superior Austrian and Sardinian forces, Napoleon employed revolutionary tactics that redefined warfare. He abandoned traditional linear formations, instead relying on rapid movements, concentrated attacks at decisive points, and the element of surprise. His campaigns were characterized by lightning-fast marches, audacious maneuvers to outflank and divide enemy forces, and a relentless pursuit of the enemy. Victories at Montenotte, Millesimo, Arcole, Rivoli, and Lodi shattered the Austrian and Sardinian armies. He famously declared, "I saw the world rushing beneath me, as if I were being carried into the air." These triumphs were not just military, they were profoundly political. Napoleon dictated peace treaties, most notably the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797, which formally ended the War of the First Coalition. This treaty saw Austria cede the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, and recognize French control over much of northern Italy, where Napoleon established a series of sister republics, client states, like the Cisalpine Republic. He returned to Paris a national hero, his name synonymous with victory, his reputation eclipsing that of the Directory he served. Despite his immense popularity, Napoleon was too ambitious to remain idle. Recognizing that a direct challenge to the Directory might be premature, and seeking to further enhance his prestige, while striking a blow against Britain, he proposed the Egyptian campaign, 1798 to 1799. The strategic aim was to disrupt Britain's lucrative trade routes to India and potentially open a path to the east, challenging British global dominance. In May 1798, Napoleon embarked with a large expeditionary force, including a contingent of scientists, scholars, and artists, reflecting the Enlightenment spirit of scientific inquiry. Initially, the campaign saw early successes, with French forces capturing Malta and winning the Battle of the Pyramids against the Mamluks. However, the campaign was ultimately a military failure. A British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson annihilated the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile in August 1798, effectively trapping Napoleon's army in Egypt. Subsequent campaigns in Syria proved unsuccessful, and the French faced fierce resistance and disease. Despite the military setbacks, the expedition had a profound cultural impact. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone by French scholars proved crucial for deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs, opening up ancient Egyptian civilization to modern understanding. Napoleon himself, abandoning his army in Egypt, managed to return to France in October 1799, carefully cultivating a narrative of success and emphasizing the scientific achievements rather than the military failures. His return was met with public acclaim, as news of his defeats had been largely suppressed or downplayed. While Napoleon was campaigning abroad, the Directory's internal crisis had deepened considerably. Its government was increasingly characterized by inefficiency, rampant corruption, and a cycle of political purges and coups. The annual elections often produced results unfavorable to the Directory, which then resorted to illegal means, such as annulling election results and relying on military force to maintain power. The economy remained in shambles, with hyperinflation and a lack of public confidence. The Directory had lost the trust of both the political elite and the general populace. Its reliance on the army to suppress internal dissent and annul election. Results highlighted its fundamental weakness and its growing dependence on military power. The stage was set for a decisive intervention. A key figure in orchestrating this intervention was Emmanuel Joseph Size, a prominent member of the Directory, who had grown disillusioned with its ineffectiveness. Size, along with other conspirators, believed that France needed a stronger, more centralized executive power to bring stability and protect the gains of the revolution from both royalist reaction and Jacobin extremism. They sought a popular general to provide the military muscle for a coup, and Napoleon, with his immense popularity and proven military prowess, was the ideal candidate. Napoleon, for his part, saw the political vacuum and the opportunity to seize power. The coup of 18 Brumaire, year 8, November 9, 1799, was meticulously planned, though somewhat clumsily executed. The conspirators, using the pretext of a fabricated Jacobin plot, convinced the councils to move their sessions to St. Cloud, ostensibly for their safety. Napoleon was given command of the troops in Paris, ostensibly to protect the legislative bodies. Once at St. Cloud, Napoleon, accompanied by his grenadiers, entered the Council of 500, where he was met with hostility and shouts of "Down with the dictator," and "Outlaw him." He faltered, but his brother Lucien Bonaparte, who was president of the Council of 500, dramatically intervened. Lucien, claiming that Napoleon was being threatened by assassins, called upon the troops to clear the hall. The grenadiers, led by Joachim Murat, dispersed the deputies. In the ensuing chaos, a rump group of deputies, loyal to the conspirators, was assembled and voted to abolish the Directory and establish a new provisional government. The consulate was formally established with the promulgation of the Constitution of Year 8 in December 1799. This new governmental structure effectively concentrated power in the hands of 3 consuls, but it was clear from the outset that Napoleon Bonaparte, as first consul, held the overwhelming majority of authority. The other 2 consuls, Size and Roger Ducos, quickly became subordinate figures. The Constitution was deliberately vague on the separation of powers and included no declaration of rights, a stark departure from earlier revolutionary documents. It was designed to provide a facade of republicanism while enabling a strong, centralized executive. Napoleon, now effectively the dictator of France, immediately set about consolidating his power and bringing an end to the decade of revolutionary chaos, not his initial actions as first consul were aimed at stabilizing France internally and restoring order. He skillfully played various factions against each other, offering amnesty to many emigrants and non-juring priests, thereby reducing the royalist threat and reconciling a significant portion of the population with the new regime. He suppressed the remaining Jacobin and royalist insurrections with ruthless efficiency. Economically, he initiated crucial reforms, creating the Bank of France in 1800 to stabilize the currency and manage the national debt, and implementing a more efficient and equitable tax collection system. He also pursued a policy of religious reconciliation, culminating in the Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII, which recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens, while maintaining state control over the church and religious tolerance for other faiths. This agreement healed the deep religious schism that had plagued France since the civil constitution of the clergy, further unifying the nation. Under Napoleon's firm hand, France experienced a period of unprecedented internal peace and administrative efficiency. He established a highly centralized bureaucracy, appointing prefects to govern the departments, ensuring direct control from Paris. The legal system was rationalized, laying the groundwork for the monumental Napoleonic Code, which would be fully promulgated in 1804. This period of consolidation, marked by strong authoritarian rule, effectively brought the revolutionary period to a close, replacing its tumultuous idealism with a pragmatic pursuit of order and national glory. Napoleon had saved France from anarchy, but in doing so, he had transformed the Republic into a highly centralized state, where the ideals of liberty and popular sovereignty were increasingly subservient to the will of a single, powerful individual. The stage was now set for the next chapter, the transformation of the consulate into an empire, and the unleashing of a new era of European warfare on an unprecedented scale. The period following the coup of 18 Brumaire and the establishment of a consulate marked a pivotal transition for France, moving from the tumultuous, often chaotic, revolutionary decade towards a new era defined by order, centralization, and the singular will of Napoleon Bonaparte. As first consul, Napoleon wasted no time in consolidating his power, skillfully leveraging his immense popularity and military prestige to reshape the political landscape. He understood that stability was the paramount desire of a war-weary nation, and he delivered it with ruthless efficiency. Internally, Napoleon embarked on a sweeping program of administrative and legal reform. He established a highly centralized bureaucracy, appointing prefects to govern each department. These prefects, directly accountable to Paris, ensured uniform application of laws and efficient tax collection across the entire nation, effectively dismantling the last vestiges of regional autonomy and strengthening the central government's grip. He reformed the tax system, making it more equitable and efficient, and created the Bank of France in 1800, a crucial institution that stabilized the national currency, managed the national debt, and fostered economic recovery by providing a stable financial environment for trade and industry. This economic stability, a stark contrast to the hyperinflation and chaos of the Directory, garnered widespread support for his regime. Perhaps one of his most significant acts of reconciliation was the Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII. Agreement healed the deep religious schism that had plagued France since the civil constitution of the clergy, recognizing Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens, while maintaining state control over the church through the appointment of bishops and the payment of clerical salaries. Critically, it also guaranteed religious tolerance for Protestants and Jews, demonstrating a pragmatic approach to unity rather than ideological purity. This move brought a vast segment of the population, particularly in rural areas, back into the fold and removed a major source of counter-revolutionary sentiment. Simultaneously, he offered amnesty to many emigrants, allowing them to return to France, further reducing internal opposition and fostering a sense of national unity under his leadership. While presenting the facade of republicanism, Napoleon systematically eroded the remaining democratic elements of the consulate. Through a series of carefully orchestrated plebiscites, he steadily increased his personal authority. In 1802, capitalizing on his military victories and domestic reforms, he was declared consul for life, effectively making him the permanent, unelected head of state. This move was a clear step towards monarchy, disguised under a republican title. Opposition, whether from disillusioned Jacobin or persistent royalists, was swiftly and brutally suppressed. The discovery of royalist plots, such as the Cadoudal conspiracy to assassinate him in 1803, provided Napoleon with the perfect pretext to further centralize power and eliminate perceived threats. The controversial execution of the Duke of Enghien, a Bourbon prince living in exile, in 1804, despite flimsy evidence of his involvement in the plot, sent a chilling message to both royalists and foreign powers. Napoleon would tolerate no challenge to his authority, and he was willing to shed royal blood. These events paved the way for the ultimate transformation, On May 18, 1804, a new constitution was promulgated, declaring France an empire, and Napoleon Bonaparte its hereditary emperor. A subsequent plebiscite overwhelmingly ratified this decision, demonstrating the public's desire for stability and their faith in Napoleon. On December 2, 1804, in a grand and symbolic ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French, with Pope Pius VII present, but relegated to a secondary role. This act, echoing Charlemagne, but asserting his own self-made authority, marked the formal end of the First French Republic and the beginning of the First French Empire. The revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality were now officially subsumed. Under the authoritarian rule of an emperor, though Napoleon would always claim to be the embodiment and protector of the revolution's gains, he established a new imperial nobility, rewarding loyal generals and administrators, creating a system of patronage that bound the elite to his regime. The establishment of the empire did not bring peace. Rather, it intensified the conflicts that had already engulfed Europe. Britain, under the resolute leadership of William Pitt the Younger, remained Napoleon's most implacable foe, refusing to acknowledge his imperial title and viewing his expansionist ambitions as a direct threat to the European balance of power. The brief Peace of Amiens 1802-1803, which had temporarily halted hostilities between France and Britain, quickly broke down, leading to renewed warfare. Napoleon, recognizing Britain's naval supremacy, began planning a massive invasion of the British Isles, assembling a vast army at Boulogne. However, Britain's diplomatic efforts, coupled with Napoleon's continued expansion on the continent, soon led to the formation of the Third Coalition in 1805, uniting Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden against France. This alliance forced Napoleon to abandon his invasion plans for Britain and pivot his formidable army, now known as the Grande Armée, eastward. What followed was a dazzling display of military genius that cemented Napoleon's reputation as one of history's greatest commanders. In a lightning campaign, Napoleon executed a masterful strategic maneuver known as the Ulm Campaign in October 1805. He swiftly marched the Grande Armée hundreds of miles across Europe, catching the unsuspecting Austrian army under General Mack completely off guard. Through a series of rapid encirclements and feints, Napoleon trapped the main Austrian force at Ulm, forcing its surrender without a major battle. This brilliant strategic victory, achieved with minimal French casualties, demonstrated Napoleon's unparalleled ability to move and concentrate his forces with incredible speed and precision, demoralizing his enemies before they could even fully engage. Just weeks later, however, France suffered a crushing blow at sea. On October 21, 1805, the combined French and Spanish fleets, attempting to break the British blockade, were decisively defeated by the Royal Navy under Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar. Nelson, though mortally wounded, achieved a spectacular victory, destroying a significant portion of the Franco-Spanish fleet and ensuring British naval supremacy for the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars. This defeat permanently ended Napoleon's hopes of invading Britain and forced him to focus his strategic efforts entirely on continental domination. Undeterred by Trafalgar, Napoleon turned his attention to the formidable combined armies of Austria and Russia, commanded by their respective emperors, Francis I and Alexander I. On December 2, 1805, the first anniversary of his coronation, Napoleon achieved his most celebrated victory at the Battle of Austerlitz, often hailed as his tactical masterpiece. Facing a larger Austro-Russian force, Napoleon lured his enemies into a trap on the Pratzen Heights, then executed a perfectly timed counterattack that shattered the Allied center. The battle was a resounding triumph, demonstrating Napoleon's tactical brilliance, his ability to read the battlefield, and his masterful use of deception and maneuver. Austerlitz effectively crippled the Third Coalition. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed shortly after, forced Austria to cede vast territories, including Venice and Tyrol, and recognized Napoleon's new creations in Germany and Italy. Crucially, the victory also led to the formal dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, an entity that had existed for over 1,000 years, and its replacement with the Confederation of the Rhine, a French client state comprising various German principalities under Napoleon's protection. The humiliation of Austria and the reshaping of the German states provoked a new challenger. Prussia, which had remained neutral during the Third Coalition, felt its prestige and security threatened by French dominance in Germany. In 1806, Prussia, encouraged by Britain and Russia, formed the Fourth Coalition against France. However, the Prussian army, clinging to outdated tactics and led by aging generals, was no match for Napoleon's modernized Grande Army. In a stunning display of French military superiority, Napoleon inflicted a devastating double defeat on the Prussians at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt. On October 14, 1806, the Prussian army was utterly annihilated, its command structure shattered, and its famed military reputation irrevocably tarnished. Within weeks, Napoleon marched triumphantly into Berlin, effectively conquering Prussia. From Berlin, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree in November 1806, formally initiating the Continental System. This ambitious economic blockade aimed to cripple Britain by prohibiting all trade between continental Europe and the British Isles, forcing all European ports under French control or influence to close to British goods. Napoleon believed that by cutting off Britain's markets and access to raw materials, he could force its economic collapse and submission. While it caused some hardship in Britain, the continental system was ultimately a failure, difficult, in force, unpopular in many parts of Europe due to economic disruption, and led to widespread smuggling, ultimately proving more damaging to continental economies than to Britain's. With Prussia defeated, Napoleon turned his attention to the remaining major power of the Fourth Coalition, Russia. The brutal winter campaign of 1806-1807 saw the Grande Armée push eastward into Poland and East Prussia. The Battle of Eylau in February 1807 was a bloody, indecisive stalemate fought in a blizzard, demonstrating the ferocity of Russian resistance and the limits of French endurance. However, Napoleon regrouped and in June 1807 achieved a decisive victory over the Russian army at the Battle of Friedland. This crushing defeat forced Tsar Alexander I to seek peace. The subsequent treaties of Tilsit, signed in July 1807 on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, represented the zenith of Napoleon's power and the redrawing of the European map. Russia, defeated but not entirely broken, agreed to become an ally of France, joining the continental system and recognizing Napoleon's territorial gains. Prussia, however, was treated harshly, losing significant territory and being forced to pay heavy indemnities. The treaties also led to the creation of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, a Polish state under French influence, and the Kingdom of Westphalia, further consolidating French dominance in Central Europe. By 1807, Napoleon's Grand Empire had reached its formidable peak. He directly ruled France and its annexed territories, including Belgium, parts of Italy, and the Rhineland. Around this core lay a ring of sister republics and satellite kingdoms ruled by his relatives or loyal marshals. For example, the Kingdom of Italy, the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Holland, the Confederation of the Rhine, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Beyond these were allied states like Russia and Austria, forced into submission or alliance. Napoleon had not only transformed the political map of Europe, but had also begun to export the administrative and legal reforms of the French Revolution, most notably the Napoleonic Code, to these conquered and allied territories. This code, based on principles of equality before the law, protection of property rights, and the abolition of feudal privileges, had a profound and lasting impact, modernizing legal systems across the continent. However, this imposition of French will, even with its progressive elements, also began to sow the seeds of future resistance, fostering the very nationalism that would eventually contribute to Napoleon's downfall. The stage was set for the next, even more ambitious and ultimately fatal, phase of his imperial expansion. The zenith of Napoleon's power, marked by the treaties of Tilsit in 1807, was paradoxically also the beginning of the seeds of his eventual downfall. His grand empire, while seemingly unassailable, was built on a foundation of military conquest and the forced imposition of French will, which inevitably generated deep-seated resentment and resistance across Europe. The very systems designed to consolidate his power and cripple his archenemy, Britain, would ultimately prove to be his undoing. The continental system, initiated with the Berlin Decree in 1806 and reinforced by subsequent decrees, was Napoleon's grand strategic gamble to defeat Britain by economic means. By prohibiting all trade between continental Europe and the British Isles, he aimed to cut off Britain's markets and access to raw materials, thereby forcing its economic collapse and submission. However, this ambitious blockade was a monumental failure, proving far more detrimental to the economies of continental Europe than to Britain's. Britain, with its formidable global naval supremacy, simply redirected its trade to its vast colonial empire, the Americas, and other parts of the world, finding new markets and sources of supply. Furthermore, the system was incredibly difficult to enforce across such a vast coastline, leading to widespread and lucrative smuggling operations that undermined its effectiveness. European populations, accustomed to British colonial goods like sugar, coffee, and cotton, resented the shortages and inflated prices caused by the blockade. Merchants and industrialists across the continent suffered from the loss of vital British markets and raw materials, leading to economic hardship and a growing unpopularity of French rule. The necessity of enforcing the continental system, particularly against recalcitrant states like Portugal and Russia, would directly lead to Napoleon's most disastrous military misadventures. The first major bleeding wound for Napoleon's empire was the Peninsular War, 1808 to 1814, a conflict that Napoleon himself famously dubbed his Spanish ulcer. His attempt to enforce the continental system in Portugal, a long-standing British ally, led to the invasion of the Iberian Peninsula. In 1808, Napoleon orchestrated the removal of the Spanish Bourbon monarchy, installing his brother Joseph Bonaparte as King of Spain. This blatant act of usurpation ignited a spontaneous and ferocious popular uprising across Spain on May 2, 1808, the Das de Mayo, met by brutal French repression. The Spanish people, fueled by fervent patriotism, religious devotion, and a deep hatred of foreign occupation, refused to accept French rule. They engaged in a relentless and innovative form of warfare, guerrilla warfare. Small, decentralized bands of irregular fighters, operating with the support of the local population, launched continuous, harassing attacks on French supply lines, isolated garrisons, and marching columns. This form of warfare, characterized by its fluidity and brutality, was incredibly difficult for the conventional French army to counter. It tied down hundreds of thousands of Napoleon's best troops, draining his resources and manpower in a protracted, unwinnable struggle. Crucially, the Peninsular War also saw the direct intervention of Britain. Under the brilliant leadership of Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, British expeditionary forces landed in Portugal and began a series of highly successful campaigns against the French. Wellington, a master of defensive tactics and logistics, exploited the rugged terrain and the support of the local populace. inflicting significant defeats on French marshals at battles like Talavera, 1809, Salamanca, 1812, and Vittoria, 1813. The Peninsular War became a continuous debilitating drain on French resources, a constant bleeding wound that diverted vital troops and attention from the Central European theater, significantly weakening Napoleon's overall strategic position. While bogged down in Spain, Napoleon faced another challenge. In 1809, Austria, sensing an opportunity to regain lost territories and prestige while Napoleon's forces were dispersed, formed the Fifth Coalition with Britain and declared war on France. Napoleon, demonstrating his enduring military genius, swiftly responded, personally leading a new campaign. Despite a series of hard-fought battles, including the costly French victory at Wagram in July 1809, Austria was once again defeated. The Treaty of Schönbrunn forced Austria to cede more territory and join the continental system. This victory, however, came at a much higher cost than previous ones, highlighting the growing difficulty of Napoleon's campaigns and the increasing resilience of his enemies. To further cement his alliance with Austria and secure a legitimate heir, Napoleon divorced his beloved Empress Josephine and married Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian Emperor Francis I, in 1810. This dynastic marriage, while politically expedient, was viewed by some as a betrayal of revolutionary principles, and did little to quell the underlying anti-French sentiment in Austria. Indeed, one of the most significant and ironic consequences of Napoleon's conquests and the imposition of French rule was the burgeoning of European nationalism. While the French Revolution had initially spread ideals of liberty and self-determination, Napoleon's imperial ambitions transformed these into instruments of French domination. The imposition of the Napoleonic Code, the continental system, conscription, and heavy taxes, coupled with the presence of French occupation forces, ignited a powerful backlash. In Germany, intellectuals and reformers, inspired by figures like Johann Gottlieb Fichte, began to articulate a distinct German national identity, leading to military and educational reforms in Prussia aimed at resisting French hegemony. In Spain, the brutal occupation forged a fierce sense of national unity against the French. Even in Russia, the violation of its sovereignty and the economic hardship caused by the continental system fueled a powerful surge of patriotism. Napoleon's attempts to create a unified European empire under French leadership inadvertently fostered the very nationalistic sentiments that would eventually rise up to dismantle it. The ultimate turning point in Napoleon's fortunes came with the catastrophic Russian campaign of 1812. The Franco-Russian alliance forged at Tilsit had always been fragile. Strained by Russia's resentment over the creation of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, a potential precursor to a revived Polish state threatening Russian interests, and most critically, Tsar Alexander I's growing reluctance to enforce the economically ruinous continental system. Convinced that Russia was preparing for war, and seeing it as the final obstacle to his complete domination of Europe, Napoleon decided on a preemptive invasion. In June 1812, he assembled the largest army ever seen in European history, the Grande Armée, numbering over 600,000 men, a multinational force drawn from across his vast empire. The campaign was a disaster from the outset. The Russian commanders, Mikhail Barclay de Tolly and later Mikhail Kutuzov, adopted a brilliant and devastating strategy, a scorched earth policy combined with strategic retreat. They avoided decisive engagements, drawing the Grande Armée deeper and deeper into the vast, inhospitable Russian interior, stretching French supply lines to their breaking point. The French army suffered enormous losses not from battle, but from disease, starvation, heat, and desertion. The only major pitched battle was the incredibly bloody Battle of Borodino in September 1812, a tactical stalemate that saw immense casualties on both sides, but opened the path to Moscow. Napoleon entered Moscow in mid-September, expecting a surrender, but found the city largely deserted and, soon after, engulfed in a massive fire, likely set by the retreating Russians. With no surrender, no supplies, and the onset of the brutal Russian winter looming, Napoleon was forced to order a retreat in October. The retreat from Moscow became one of the most infamous military catastrophes in history. Harassed by Cossack raids, suffering from extreme cold, starvation, and disease, and constantly exposed to the elements, the Grande Armée disintegrated. The crossing of the Berezina River in November, under constant Russian attack, became a symbol of the desperate and horrific nature of the retreat. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée limped back across the Russian border in December, only tens of thousands of men remained. The vast majority had perished, not in battle, but from the brutal conditions. This catastrophic loss of manpower and prestige irrevocably shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility and emboldened his enemies. The devastation of the Russian campaign immediately triggered the formation of the Sixth Coalition in 1813, a formidable alliance that finally united all the major European powers against Napoleon. Russia, Prussia, now revitalized and eager for revenge. Austria, which finally abandoned its alliance with France, Sweden, and Britain. Napoleon, despite his genius, was now fighting a war of attrition he could not win. He desperately raised new armies, but these were largely composed of young, inexperienced conscripts, the Marie Louises, named after the Empress, lacking the veteran quality of the Grande Armée that had been lost in Russia. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Leipzig, October 16th to 19th, 1813, also known as the Battle of the Nations. This was the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, involving over 500,000 soldiers. Despite Napoleon's tactical skill, his forces were vastly outnumbered and outmaneuvered by the combined Allied armies. After 4 days of brutal fighting, Napoleon suffered a crushing and irreversible defeat. Leipzig marked the end of French dominance in Germany and signaled the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. Following Leipzig, the Allied armies began the invasion of France in early 1814. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Napoleon launched a brilliant defensive campaign, showcasing his tactical mastery one last time, inflicting several minor defeats on the advancing Allied forces. However, his efforts were ultimately futile against the sheer weight of numbers. The Allied armies, after bypassing Paris to avoid a protracted urban battle, marched directly on the capital. On March 31, 1814, Paris fell to the coalition forces. Paris occupied, and his marshals refusing to continue the fight. Recognizing the futility of further resistance, Napoleon was forced to confront the inevitable. On April 6, 1814, at Fontainebleau, he formally abdicated his throne unconditionally. The Treaty of Fontainebleau exiled him to the small island of Elba in the Mediterranean, allowing him to retain his imperial title and a small personal guard. The Bourbon monarchy was subsequently restored to France, with Louis XVIII, the brother of the executed Louis XVI, ascending to the throne. Europe breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing the tumultuous era of Napoleon and the French Revolution had finally come to a definitive end. But the story, as history would soon reveal, was not quite over. The abdication of Napoleon in April 1814 and his exile to the island of Elba seemed, to many, to signal the definitive end of an era of unprecedented upheaval. Europe, exhausted by 2 decades of relentless warfare, breathed a collective sigh of relief as the Bourbon monarchy, in the person of Louis XVIII, was restored to the French throne. The victorious Allied powers convened the Congress of Vienna, a grand diplomatic gathering to redraw the map of Europe and establish a new balance of power, aiming to roll back the revolutionary tide and restore the old monarchical order. Yet the story of Napoleon, and indeed the revolutionary epic, was not quite finished. Less than a year into his seemingly tranquil exile, the indomitable spirit of Napoleon Bonaparte proved impossible to contain. On February 26, 1815, in an act of audacious daring that stunned Europe, he escaped from Elba, slipping past British naval patrols. With a small contingent of loyal guards, he landed on the French coast near Antibes on March 1st. What followed was an astonishing, almost mythical journey across France. Louis XVIII dispatched troops to apprehend him, but as Napoleon marched northward, the very soldiers sent to capture him defected to his side, rallying to their beloved emperor with cries of "Vive l'Empereur." He famously confronted a royal regiment, sent to stop him, opening his coat and inviting them to fire, an act of supreme confidence that won their immediate allegiance. Without firing a single shot, Napoleon marched triumphantly into Paris on March 20th, 1815, forcing Louis XVIII to flee. This extraordinary return, known as the 100 Days, demonstrated the enduring loyalty of the French army and a significant portion of the populace who still saw Napoleon as the embodiment of French glory and a protector against a perceived return to the ancien regime. However, the European powers, having just painstakingly re-established a fragile peace, were not prepared to tolerate Napoleon's return to power. They immediately declared him an outlaw and formed the Seventh Coalition, uniting Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia in a renewed determination to crush him once and for all. Napoleon, recognizing that his only hope lay in a swift, decisive victory that could break the coalition before its full strength could be brought to bear, decided to strike first. He aimed to defeat the Anglo-Allied army under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blucher in Belgium before they could unite. The climactic confrontation came on June 18, 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo near Brussels. It was a brutal, patricinal struggle fought on a rain-soaked battlefield. Wellington, renowned for his defensive prowess, skillfully positioned his Anglo-Allied forces along a ridge, weathering repeated French assaults throughout the day. Napoleon, suffering from illness and perhaps a slight decline in his strategic acumen, made several tactical errors, including delaying his main attack and underestimating the resilience of his opponents. The battle hung in the balance for hours, with the French Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite veterans, launching a final desperate charge. However, the timely and decisive arrival of Blucher's Prussian forces on Napoleon's right flank, after a grueling march, turned the tide. The combined pressure of Wellington's steadfast defense and the Prussian assault shattered the French lines, leading to a catastrophic rout. Waterloo was a total defeat for Napoleon, ending his military career and his imperial ambitions definitively. Following the devastating defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon returned to Paris, but his political support had evaporated. His marshals and the legislative bodies refused to continue the fight. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second and final time. He attempted to flee to America, but was ultimately forced to surrender to the British, hoping for asylum. Instead, the Allied powers, determined to prevent any further returns, exiled him to the remote, isolated island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, over 1,000 miles from the nearest continent. There, under strict British guard, the former Emperor of the French spent his remaining years, dictating his memoirs and reflecting on his extraordinary life, until his death on May 5, 1821, likely from stomach cancer. His final exile ensured that the Napoleonic Wars and the revolutionary period they extended had truly come to an end. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, spanning from the late 18th century to the early 19th, left an indelible and multifaceted legacy that continues to shape our world. This period was far more than just a series of conflicts. It was a profound crucible that forged many of the political, social, and legal structures we recognize today. Politically, the era irrevocably shattered the concept of absolute monarchy and divine right, replacing it with the principle of popular sovereignty, the idea that legitimate political authority derives from the consent of the governed. Wow! France oscillated between republics and empires. The seed of republicanism was firmly planted, inspiring democratic movements worldwide. The very notion of a constitution as the supreme law of the land, limiting governmental power and guaranteeing citizens' rights, became a foundational principle for modern states. The idea of the nation-state, where political boundaries align with a shared national identity, was powerfully reinforced, often ironically, by Napoleon's conquests, which inadvertently fostered nationalism in other lands. Socially, the revolution delivered a decisive blow to the rigid, hierarchical society of the Ancien regime. The abolition of feudalism, the dismantling of aristocratic privileges, and the principle of equality before the law fundamentally reshaped social structures. While economic disparities persisted, the legal framework for a more meritocratic society was established, where talent and achievement, rather than birth, could theoretically determine one's place. The rise of the bourgeoisie as a dominant social and political force was a direct consequence of these changes. Legally, Napoleon's most enduring legacy is the Napoleonic Code, or Civil Code of 1804. This comprehensive and logically structured legal system codified many of the revolutionary principles, such as equality before the law, protection of private property, and the abolition of hereditary privilege. It became the model for legal systems in numerous countries across Europe, Latin America, and beyond, profoundly influencing civil law traditions worldwide and serving as a testament to the revolution's commitment to rationalizing and standardizing the legal framework. Militarily, the Napoleonic Wars revolutionized warfare itself. The levy en masse introduced mass conscription, transforming armies from small, professional forces into vast, national armies fueled by patriotic fervor. This led to the concept of total war, where the entire resources of a nation were mobilized for conflict. Napoleon's strategic and tactical innovations, rapid troop movements, concentration of force, combined arms tactics, and the reliance on decisive battles set new standards for military leadership and profoundly influenced military thought for generations. Finally, the period had a profound global impact. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, though often distorted by French imperial ambitions, resonated deeply across the Atlantic, inspiring independence movements in Latin America against Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule. The redrawing of the European map at the Congress of Vienna, while attempting to restore stability, also laid the groundwork for future conflicts, particularly by suppressing nascent national aspirations in Germany and Italy, which would eventually lead to their unification movements later in the 19th century. The very concept of international diplomacy and collective security, embodied by the Congress of Vienna, was also a direct response to the Napoleonic threat. In conclusion, the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars were not just a series of historical events. They were a crucible that forged the modern world. They unleashed powerful forces of change, republicanism, nationalism, legal equality, and mass warfare that irrevocably altered the course of human history. From the storming of the Bastille to the fields of Waterloo, this period was a dramatic interplay of inspiring ideals and brutal realities, of grand aspirations and devastating human cost. It taught us about the fragility of power, the enduring human yearning for freedom, and the complex, often contradictory, path of progress. Understanding this era is not just about looking back. It's about understanding the very foundations upon which our contemporary political thought, social structures, and international relations are built. Thank you so much for joining me on this epic journey through one of history's most pivotal periods. I hope you found this deep dive as fascinating and enlightening as I did. What aspects of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars do you find most compelling, or perhaps most tragic? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading your insights and engaging in these discussions. If you enjoyed this comprehensive exploration and want to continue uncovering the forces that shaped our world, please give this video a big thumbs up, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and most importantly, if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next historical adventure. Your support truly makes these videos possible. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.